All right, great. Welcome, everyone. We are streaming live here on the City of Eugene Facebook page, as well as our City of Eugene YouTube channel for transportation planning. We are bringing you the lunchtime presentation of becoming a world-class biking city. And I'm really excited to have some special guests on with us today to talk and just have a conversation about what our path to greatness as the City of Eugene looks like. And so my name is Shane Rhodes. I'm the Transportation Options Coordinator for the City of Eugene, and I work on all of our programmatic pieces of our active transportation strategic plan, everything from Sunday streets and open streets to our smart trips and bicycle safety education, different programmatic pieces with our transportation options regional programming. And on our transportation planning team, we have a great group of people working with our public works team and the City of Eugene leadership on how do we reach our goals that are in our transportation system plan to triple our walking and biking mode shares. And today we're going to talk about what do we need to do, what are other cities doing, what are our opportunities and barriers. And so we'll get right into it with our guests. I'll have them introduce themselves. We'll start out with Anne, and then Mark, and then Matt. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, what organization or organizations you're with, and what kind of work you do, and maybe a favorite, a bike that you ride most often.
Sure. Well, welcome all. Good to be with you. I'm Anne Brown. I'm an assistant professor in community and regional planning at the University of Oregon. And I do research on transportation equity, shared mobility, and travel behavior. And my favorite and only bike that I currently ride is it's from the 1970s. It's a Univega from Craigslist. I've had it for quite a few years. It's very sturdy and handy, and currently has a basket and a kiddo seat on it. So it's a workhorse.
All around utility bike.
It is.
All right. How about you, Mark?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Mark Schlossberg. I'm a professor, also in the department of the School of Planning, Public Policy, and Management at the University of Oregon. And I focus on how to redesign cities so that more people can walk, bike, scoot, take transit more of the time. And I lead a study abroad for the last decade, where I bring students and professionals to the Netherlands and Denmark to learn how to redesign cities from the best cities for people on bike. In terms of my own bike riding, I'm happy to say that at the age of 51, I just bought my first ever bike. All my other bikes in my life have been hand-me-downs. And so the hand-me-down that I just sold last weekend was maybe a Trek, I don't remember, that I converted into an extra cycle so that I could take my kids to school when they were younger and not have them have to carry 70-pound backpacks to school. And the folks who bought it actually went to graduate school in Utrecht in the Netherlands and were extremely happy to have my weirdly decked out upright, but not upright, extra cycle converted bike. Like, they got it right away. So that brought joy to me.
That's great. And we are getting a little chop from you on your audio, Mark, just so you know. There's a way you can improve the connectivity. All right, and Matt?
Hi, I'm Matt Rodriguez. I'm the Acting Public Works Director for the City of Eugene. I work with Shane. Over the years, I've worked kind of in many different aspects of transportation, capital projects, and planning. I was a designer for a period of time, worked as a traffic engineer for a period of time. I've had some different roles, city engineer. Really in this role, it's about taking city council goals and direction and translating that into the policy and implementation steps that we take as a city to reach those goals. So I'm happy to have worked with Mark and taken a study tour abroad with him to see some of the different ways other countries, especially in Europe, are really attacking these goals and what it looks like to realize the vision. So happy to talk more today.
Great. Yeah, and I just want to highlight to folks that, this little mini panel, I really am excited about because we have some, academic and lived experiences as well as sort of on the ground in the city, what does it take to get it done? And so I hope that we can have some good dreaming and then some good reality checks and some good discussions of what it would take to get us to these goals. I also wanted to highlight that folks watching on YouTube or on Facebook, feel free to leave your comments, ask questions, and be part of the conversation. Welcome to Rob Zako, who's joining us online. So if anyone has any questions as we go along, please feel free to throw them up, and we'll try and get to the ones that we can. We're going to go through a few different sections, and I'm just going to allow the panelists to talk a little bit. We're going to start out with a 1-minute speed round of what do you think the advantages are to becoming a world-class city? I mean, we know that one advantage is that it can help us achieve our city goals around climate and energy action plan. But beyond reaching our goals, sort of like why reach those goals, and what are the advantages? And Matt, we'll start with you, and we'll go backwards order this time.
All right, thanks, Shane. And I forgot to talk about my bike. So I ride a Trek something or other that's just a kind of a commuter bike. But I did buy a mountain bike last year during the pandemic and rode it a few times, and I hadn't had one for years, and I really loved that. So yeah, I think it's a great question, Shane. There's a plethora of reasons why it's a good idea, and not only around reaching our climate goals, where our transportation system plan implementation is a huge part of reaching those, but around equity and access for all of our community, allowing people to have basically mobility freedom to get to where they want to go in the mode of their choice. So we have a number of goals that all come together to reach this vision. Transportation safety, which is a big part of making a comfortable, safe environment for people to do it. Our climate action goals that really push on doing things differently. Our land use goals that really want to have a walkable, bikeable, transit-friendly community. So for me, when I think of this, and I think of the places that I have really enjoyed being, there are those types of places where you can get around easily, you can walk, bike, you really feel like that's an integrated part of the city and the way people live. And I love Eugene, and I think we've got some really good attributes as far as being that type of city, but there's a lot more work to do.
Great. So, so to me, to be a world-class bike city means that we are actually meeting our challenges for climate change. We're meeting our challenges to address issues of household affordability and municipal affordability, for our taxpayers. We're meeting our challenges to address issues of public health. We are meeting our challenges around social cohesion and social trust building among the population. And we're also meeting our larger societal values of freedom and independence by being able to create a system that allows anyone, regardless of economic ability, physical ability, or age, to be able to fully access our city and everything that our city has to offer. So that's me in a nutshell.
And the only thing I'll add, because I agree with both the points that Matt and Mark made, is one of the huge benefits of becoming a world-class bike city would be, kind of to Matt's point, is to basically be able to liberate people from their cars. So every year, AAA comes out with an estimated cost of how much it costs households to own and operate a car every year. It's about $9,000. It goes up every year. And so, one of the challenges, why do so many households in the U.S. own a car? It's because usually there's not robust options to do all the trips that people need to make. And so one of the benefits of being a really world-class bike city is to allow people to shed those cars. So if people don't want to own a car, if they can use that $9,000 to do other things in their lives. And so I think there's also an economic, even a household level economic benefit to becoming a world-class bike city.
Great. Yeah, agreed. I think those are all great points. I think that, most of the people who are watching sort of understand, there are lots of advantages to becoming a world-class bike city. So we don't, I didn't want to delve too deep into it because, I feel like the question on our minds today, and the thing that I want to talk about is, what does that path look like? Like, we know that this is a great thing to achieve goals, to do all of these important societal positive impact changes. But what does Eugene's path to becoming a world-class bike city look like? And so, starting out, like, what are we doing right? And what do we need to do? What does that path look like? So from your perspectives. And so, Mark, I'll start with you on this one.
Great, thanks. So I tend to think this is pretty easy to do, which is great that we have Matt here because he would tell me all the reasons why it's not easy to do. But basically, to make it happen, biking needs to be more convenient and more comfortable than any other way of getting around. And driving has to be significantly more difficult and more expensive and more inconvenient. The reality is that over the last 70 years, our transportation and land use decision-making at the policy level has basically made most of us, socially engineered most of us, to be car dependent. And so if we're serious, really serious about being a world-class bike city, we have to totally undo that dependency and make not just incentives for people to use a bike, but to make the use of a bike the first choice because it's just easy, convenient, safe, affordable, whatever is the right trigger for how individuals make their transportation decision making. So I'm sure we'll talk about sort of design and infrastructure. I'll say, like, what is the city doing right? The city of Eugene has started doing some, I'll call it like bike infrastructure 2.0. So sort of modern versions of bike infrastructure that addresses some of those the larger societal needs for feeling safe on the road on a bike. So I'll leave it there for now because I'm sure we'll get more into the weeds as we go along.
Great. All right. And Anne?
Yeah, again, agreed with Mark. Compared to other cities I've lived in, at least in the US, I'd say that Eugene has a really great foundation to become a world-class bike city. So we have a terrific amount of bike parking, for example, that, in other cities, if you're biking and you're going, where can I park my bike? I'm not supposed to be parking on a pole. Maybe I have to park a block or two away. I think that's great as a cyclist. It provides the flexibility, the really door-to-door benefit that bikes can deliver. We have a growing network of bike infrastructure. And I think overall we're oriented in a really positive direction in terms of that infrastructure investment. But to Mark's point, I think also it has to be essentially a 360 package. So we have our eye on the bike prize, but there's a lot of policies that all need to be complementary as well in order to really get us to the vision we want. And that means removing on-street parking in some cases and off-street. Basically bikes and cars don't always mix great, right? They're going different speeds. And the safest way to have the safest bike environment is really one with the fewest cars. And so the more we can separate bikes, and that might mean giving them more on-street space, taking away on-street parking, for example, which is very challenging, right? There's people, want to be able to park right on the street, right next to the business. It's going to mean a pivot away from that. It also means things that support biking are things like density, right? So more people and businesses from a shorter distance from one another mean that the bike rides themselves are shorter. People can access more destinations in a short period of time. That also benefits walking, but that means that there's going to be some zoning challenges as well to think about how can we increase the number of people and destinations within a smaller area to support both walking and biking.
Great. All right, Matt, what are we currently doing right, and what do we need to do?
Well, I really appreciate both Mark and Anne's comments, and I agree with a lot of them. I do think that we have had a good foundation because there has been been a culture of bicycling in Eugene for a long time. I believe starting mostly in the 70s, but we've been able to build upon that. And I have often thought that one of the challenges we've had in getting, I'll call it from good to great, is that we already had good. And what you'll see in some cities around the country that had very, very poor infrastructure is they were able to make some really radical shifts from zero to kind of something that's new and significant with protected bikeways. You see it in things that were done in New York, Chicago, other cities. It's been more of an interesting community conversation when you already have facilities, but they're not the type of facilities that you really want to get the 8 to 80 crowd to be able to go out and use the network, to feel comfortable with the network, to feel safe, and make that their first choice. So that kind of brings me to the community conversations, and this is where Mark and I will probably have different views on how easy it is. And I'll say that we have a lot of different goals in the city and a lot of different perspectives. And one of the values so far that we've heard from our city council is that we really engage in a dialogue, really hear from people that are affected by any project we do. And typically that takes time. It takes time, and it takes some sorting through what the concept to the project on the ground will be. So that is part, I think, of our transition, is recognizing that we need to have the amount of public outreach on our teams, or the staff capacity to do that well and move through those conversations to get the infrastructure on the ground. I think we've made really great strides with starting to build out our protected bikeway network. There's a lot more to do. I will say that I think one of the things we really need to figure out, if two-way bike facilities continue to be a preference, is when you get into signalized areas, how do we actually make that work in a way that feels good for people biking? I think folks that have been on 13th know it's really awesome potential, and we probably don't have the signal timing right to make that really feel like a corridor that it can be. I think we've done a lot of small kind of tactical changes in the last few years, and our attitude towards that has shifted, and we're really trying to take advantage of those things. So I feel really good about that, and being able to take advantage of kind of the lighter, quicker, cheaper changes in our system when we can.
Great. Yeah, thank you all. That's really good. Now I'm going to get us into some questions. We get in some really good comments and questions online. And but I just want to highlight, I think what you said, Matt, is really true, that we were, a good biking city, for the 70s. We were really cutting edge, and then we lived off of that sort of credibility and that infrastructure for a while, right? It worked for sort of who the target was at that point. But things have really changed and shifted, and other communities have, adapted some other pieces, and, we've started to do that as well. But, we already had sort of that low hanging fruit. And we're to the point now where we have to make these a little bit more difficult choices and have these more difficult conversations, because we do have to engage the community. I think Julie Daniel, highlights that, what Mark is addressing is auto entitlement, and that anytime it's less convenient for people driving cars, that, the hand wringing starts. Should we be putting more effort towards addressing that? And then, related to that is what Daniel says about the difference between making it easier to walk, roll, and take transit, and making it harder to drive, because, that's sometimes, I think, where the conflict arises, right? Is we know, that we need to make it easier and safer and more comfortable for people to bike, but often that comes at a cost to how easy and efficient it is, or convenient it is for people to drive. And so, how do we get to that piece? And I'll let you start this, Matt, and then sort of hear from Ann and Mark their thoughts on that.
Shane, I think you had a really interesting point. I mean, when we there are trade-offs when we allocate space in the right of way, and that's really what the community conversation is about, right? How we use our right of way. We're not going out and widening a bunch of streets. We realize that we want, every time you do that, you start to affect the walking environment, the sense of place, these other things. One of the things that we've actually had, interestingly, is a little bit of a disadvantage when you consider trying to move to protected bikeways, is the fact that we have had skinnier street cross sections than a lot of the rest of the country. When you go to Salt Lake City and they're putting in protected bikeways, their streets are gigantic and they can find space to do that. For us, it's a little more nuanced on what is the trade-off that we have to make in the space. You know, I've recently been reading, and some of you may be familiar with the concept of donut economics, and Mobicon, which is a Dutch design firm, has done this thing on donut mobility. And it's really talking about, where are you focusing? Like, who are we trying to serve? You don't want to have too many mobility options, because then you're starting to get outside your resource constraints, right? And you don't want to have too small, or you start to infringe on the equity and ability of all people to access the network. So where's the right place? And really what you should be focusing on there is probably not providing more options to the people that already are privileged and have a lot of options. You really need to be focusing on the folks that have limited options, and how you bring that to them, how you give them more options and more freedom in the transportation system. I think that's an interesting way to start thinking about these conversations of street space. Right? Who are we actually really trying to lift up as part of this process? It's probably not the people that are driving a car every day that need the other option, but there's other people that aren't able to do that, that probably need an expansion of safe options, the ability to decide whether they want a bike or whether the transit schedule is now increased in frequency, and it's an easier way for them to get where they need to go.
Yeah. Mark, do you want to address that, or Anne? Sort of talk about that a little bit too, but I also want to highlight this question from Alex that, you know, the last piece, you know, as you were talking, Matt, he's asked how, you know, has the city been successful to get input from diverse groups? And I think that that's part of the challenge, right? Is that, like you said, we hear from the people who it affects, and sometimes if that's about parking removal, we hear from those people, but you know, are we hearing from the people who, you know, are disenfranchised in their transportation options now? And I think that that's been the challenge. I think that we've done some really great things, but I think there's still more work to be done to make that better.
So maybe if I'll jump in here, you know, for the spirit of our nice hour together, I will disagree a lot with what Matt just had to say, but in a kind way. I think the last thing we need is more public engagement around this stuff. Like, we have already had a lot of public engagement that has led to the adoption of Envision Eugene, which is a clear long-range planning document that calls for a certain development pattern and a certain modal split. We have a climate action plan. We have Vision Zero plans. We have, you know, other policies and plans that address issues of affordability and equity. And we do not ask the public every time we want to do a sort of a project for a car. We shouldn't have to ask the public again for every time we want to do something for people on bike. And all that leads to is sort of more slowing. So if our city really is serious about meeting its goals, like, we have to get to it. And engaging the public along the way is just too time consuming and too difficult, because most of us in the public can't understand or conceive what it is truly like to exist in a system where you can get around anywhere all the time safely by bike. And so to me, this is something that we just have to start building more of it, and give more people an opportunity to experience what it's like, and that those things will progress. So that's sort of piece of it. And the other piece of it to me is, I don't know that I would focus just on.
Hey, Mark, will you try it without your hands? I think it's better without.
Okay. Is this better? Thank you. Sorry. Should I give my rant again? I think the other piece of it is I wouldn't necessarily just focus on those that have less. Like, this, to me, having a great bike city means that it's a system that works for everyone, age 8 to 80, as Matt said. And it's not just about sort of expanding choices. We have to make it more difficult to drive a car if we want to meet any of our community goals. And therefore, we have to make it easier and more convenient to get around by other modes. The reason that I'm quite passionate about bicycle transportation in particular is that it is also a space or a boundary spanning mode. So for a land use system like we have here, where things can be a little bit spread out, there's the way of travel that is actually the easiest to get to things that are a little bit more spread out. That could be difficult for walking because of distance, or really difficult for transit because of lack of density issues. So that's how I'm thinking about these things.
Great. Anne?
And yeah, both Matt and Mark, I agree with a lot of the points you both made. And I think in general, it always helps me to take a step back and think about, again, one of the easiest ways to think about our goals, I think, is often thinking about, well, who are we moving with our streets, right? We have a finite amount of street space. Are we moving vehicles or are we moving people? And often the most space efficient way to move people is through transit and biking or walking, right? And so if we can allocate our street space to really focus on the moving of people, often the answer is right before us in terms of how should we really allocate street space. I think to Julie's question about auto entitlement, I think is really interesting. And the question of, we can't remove parking, we can't reduce a lane of travel, et cetera. That is something that is not unique to Eugene, right? It comes up in every single community, anywhere one goes. And I think one way that other places have been relatively successful, or at least provided that justification when coming to the public, is providing data. So I know right now, for example, City of Eugene is collecting a lot of parking data, and U of O students, actually, I think it was fall of 2019, maybe pre-pandemic, but looking at, well, how much do we use our parking currently? And we don't use a lot of our parking. So people always say, don't take away my parking, right? I need that. There's nowhere to park. Well, the data show that there's plenty of places to park, right? It might not be the space exactly in front of the door, but there's also data that show from a business perspective, right? There's also sometimes pushback in the business community about taking away parking. Well, bicyclists buy things too, right? And there's good data out of Portland showing that bicyclists and pedestrians shop as often or spend as much at stores as drivers do. And so again, I think bringing the data to the conversation can be, I'm not going to say it's going to convince everyone, but it can be a powerful tool to say, you know what, we're going to remove parking on the street and add some bike infrastructure. This parking is only occupied X amount. And look, there's a parking right around the corner that's never occupied, or it's 2 blocks away. And so some of that could also be just communication about where is parking available. There's some great apps now that I think are already in action that you can see where a spot's available. That can help also make the supply more transparent, because we have, in general, in the US, we have way too much parking. And then to Dan's question, thinking about what is more effective about making biking easier or driving harder, and to think to Mark's point, you do need both, right? But when you look at the research, at least, bike infrastructure does get more people to bike. It can lure people into trying it when maybe they didn't perceive it as safe before. But actually, what's found is much more effective is making it more difficult to drive. So be that it's harder to find parking or it's more expensive. Price is a huge motivator, especially because it makes people think about their choices more. So it reflects on the marginal cost of that trip. If the cost of, say, parking is higher, that reflects much more closely the cost to society that parking space actually represents. And so again, the price helps people reflect on, well, is this trip really worth, say, $5 for 2 hours of parking, or maybe I'll just take my bike. And so again, I think you need both, but what the research shows is that it's really the making it harder to drive is more the stick, for lack of a better word, is more effective than the carrot, in at least immediate terms.
Yeah, and I think your point about data is also, I think that along with trials, right? Like I think that we've seen that when we present, data to people and we talk about, we're looking at this change and we're doing that community outreach and we talk about, this is what we've seen in other communities, this is what we've seen here as far as parking utilization and number of people who are using the street for one way or another. And now we're going to try this out and see, and I think South Willamette's a great example of that. There was a lot of community conversation around that, right? And so I think that it highlights both Mark and Matt's points in that, Mark is of the, mind of like, we know this is going to work, right? The data from all these other communities that have put in this kind of change have shown that they're safer, that they have, the same kind of efficiency, and, we can present that to people and they can say, I don't believe your data, or that was that city, but not Eugene, or just like that it's, we just don't trust that this is what's going to happen. And even if it does, it still, stinks, So, but then we can say, okay, let's try it, and people see it. And then, if it works, you can make it permanent. And that's what we're doing, right? And so that was a many years process. Do we have the time to do more of those kinds of things? Or how can we get to that kind of change sooner without those, right? And so my next section was going to be on barriers. And so I think that this is an important one that, has been brought up here and highlighted before of like, and so, how do we overcome that obstacle and sort of that idea that Mark raised of, do we need this much community input when we know that overall we're trying to reach these goals? And so maybe Matt and you can talk a little bit about that or throw out some other thoughts and ideas.
Yeah, so thanks, Shane. I think the expectation of engagement is real. I hear Mark, and I know the urgency we have around making changes to our transportation system and working towards our climate recovery ordinance goals. But I think one of the things that we also know is that if you move too quickly, you have a lot of unintended consequences, and you're not bringing the whole community with you. And I think we've seen that in some of these projects where we needed to pause and actually re-engage in a different way in order to be able to bring it forward and end up building trust for the next project. And my concern, and what I think I've seen, is if you do that, you end up creating more of a division if you move too fast and you really don't try to bring that conversation together and bring people into that process and hear them. And like I said, we've got a lot of goals we're trying to bring together. One of the things that makes it complicated is that the city has goals around the way that we want to do this, that we want to engage, that we want to think of equity, that we want to work on climate, that we want housing affordability. If you take any one of those goals without thinking about trying to achieve the others, it's much easier to do. If we just determine tomorrow that we're going to be a city that puts in bike infrastructure and we do not care about all of the other goals, you can go do that. It becomes much more complex, and it becomes more of a conversation you have to have when you're trying to hold all those at the same time. So I do think that that's actually a real barrier. Speaking to, some of the comments that Mark and Ann made about making it harder to drive, I think one thing that is a barrier is that I don't believe we've really explicitly heard from council that that is one of their goals. It's implied to some extent in the fact that our transportation system plan is really focused on walking, biking, and transit. And we do talk about parking management, but I do not think we've ever really explicitly said that, heard them say making driving harder is part of the goal. So I don't disagree with either of them about that. I know that's cost is a lever, convenience is a lever, but I think that's something that we really need to hear specifically from council to be able to maybe think about some of these projects and programs in a different way.
Ann, Mark?
Well, in terms of barriers, I think we've talked about a lot of them so far. I think I do think political will is one, and I would be hesitant to assume that any council would say explicitly we want to make it harder to drive. That's not necessarily a politically palatable thing to advertise. But I think a lot of, again, the implication certainly of a lot of the climate goals, saying we want a higher mode share for bikes, if we want to hire mode share for bikes, by definition, it has to come from somewhere. And given that most people drive, it's most likely going to come from driving. And so the question is then how to switch, how to get people out of their car and using these other modes. And it definitely is about providing the safe infrastructure and the options for people, right? I don't think we would reasonably expect people to get out of their cars and hop on West 11th and bike along that. I don't think that's what most of us would want to do. But can we provide a robust network that people can accomplish their goals? And again, I think to Matt's point about that cycling is one of there's a lot of goals we have and it's complementary. But again, I think some of the barriers are bigger than biking itself. It's related to, arcane code language and things like parking requirements and zoning and a lack of density, and then the pushback often that comes with that. Sometimes in the community, even those community support, on one hand, sometimes the opposition is, even if small, quite vocal. And I think that's challenging then from decision makers too, who are decision makers hearing from? Is it a majority who is relatively silent, says, yeah, that sounds fine? Or is it, a few squeaky wheels who are really adamantly opposed? And so again, it could be about who are we hearing from? Are we maybe paying community organizations to engage, paying people for their time? So we do ensure we hear from not just those on either end of the spectrum in terms of really passionately for or really passionately against. What does the rest of the community think is another question.
So I'll add around barriers. I see as sort of two scales. One's societal. I'll get to that in a sec. The other one is around the sort of policy leadership side at this, sort of city operations. So I will say, to our credit as a city and to Matt's credit, we have some really fantastic, extremely knowledgeable staff in the city of Eugene who know a lot about how to redesign our city to make it a great biking city, who have had experience in some of the world's best biking cities, are knowledgeable, etc. I guess what I have sort of seen in my 20 years here is that staff don't always have the back of either top-level administrators and then ultimately city council to actually put into practice what their knowledge set has. So sort of as Anne said, if we're going to have a climate action plan or a transportation system plan that calls for a modal switch, like inherent in that is there will be less driving, right? We cannot, I'll repeat, we cannot have a serious climate action plan without reducing driving. Like it has to happen. It has to happen, right? So then anytime that our very knowledgeable staff try to push something to meet those goals, if they don't have the back of their higher ups and they're just getting yelled at by the public for making a change to the street around parking or something like that, right? It's really difficult to get yelled at all the time, especially when you don't have the backup of your sort of top bureaucracy or the elected leaders. So that's sort of something I've observed, and then that leads into then the larger sort of public kind of problem here. Actually, there's two other issues, and the larger public problem is that most of us in the community view the street as a place to move and store cars. So the default position of how we view a street is that. And so anytime there's a sort of a suggestion to reallocate space on a street to something else, it feels like we are somehow going against nature, right? We're going against this default position of what the purpose of the street is. And so most people's experience of the street is exactly that. It's to move and store vehicles. And so it just feels like a struggle to move against that. And I'll say the last really bit quickly, which is that actually professionally, through transportation engineering profession in particular, and Matt, feel free to sort of add or push back against this, but the whole entire training around traffic engineering also views the street as a place to move and store vehicles. And so even sort of culturally, in the professional culture, I mean, it can be really hard push things in that way as well, if we're going to reallocate space on the street for other modes. So those are all the different levels. But let me reiterate that the staff that we have, like we are blessed with not just like a single person in our City of Eugene staff that knows how to make a world-class biking city. We have many people who know how to do it. And I think if we could find a way to liberate their talent and their energy and their professional abilities to go for it, we could do a lot in a quick amount of time. But that sort of takes the higher ups having their back, including council.
Some really interesting discussion and points there. And I want to highlight too that we're getting a lot more comments, and I can throw up some really engaged folks in the conversation. So thanks to everyone who's writing in their comments. I'll try to get those questions up to the panel, certain ones that are fitting. And Matt, I just want to open it up to you now to see sort of your response to that. I think that there's some good points that have been raised and some good discussion going on.
Well, I agree with Mark that traffic engineering historically really was built on cars, on moving cars, not on moving people, as Ann said, which is really what we're focused on now, moving people, even though it's hard to make that cultural shift. In the US, it's really hard. And Eugene, even though I think we're more progressive in thinking this way, there's still a lot of people that really have a hard time with the concept of not having streets be for moving cars. I think we've had a lot of programs that we've implemented in the last couple of years towards this. I know that the pace of change needs to be quick, but I think if you stop and look at everything we've done in the past few years in changing the systems and building out the systems, safe streets, it's actually a lot of great work that has been accomplished by our staff. I do think there is, I think that there is improvement in our pace that we can find in that balance of how much outreach we have and how much we're building. But again, I think part of what you've seen in the last couple of years is an attempt by us to actually build the foundation of that relationship of trust with some of the communities we're working with to be able to move a little faster. It's a little bit of the saying, you need to go slow to go fast at times. And I know I've felt in some of the conversations I've been in with our staff and the community that was an important thing that we needed to do. So I'm hopeful that we will continue to accelerate. We continue to be really successful with bringing a lot of funding in to do innovative projects that are really going to expand our bike system and our walking system. And I think we'll continue to be successful with that. And one thing I'll just add is I'm really hopeful that the administration, the presidential administration, will be able to bring a whole new level of funding and support to multimodal transportation projects and really help us move towards our goals with some pots of cash, hopefully.
Thanks. I was trying to find a comment from earlier asking about that sort of federal funding and how we think that might affect what we're able to do. And I also threw a comment up there from Alan about the city plans to spend roughly $500 million on widening Beltline. I just want to highlight that that's not city; those aren't city funds. That's an ODOT project. I think I just want to also sort of follow those words too around that we have laid that groundwork. I feel like we have laid some really good groundwork of trust in the community, that we have taken our time on some of these projects that I think were an investment in time, and South Willamette and 13th Avenue are good examples of that. I think that they took a lot of time. I think even our Safe Routes to School projects that involve a lot of action planning and outreach to the community. And, we're about to start a project out on Howard where we're going to do a lot of community engagement about how do we take this narrow roadway of this county road and repurpose it to use that space, not just for moving people in cars, but for moving people safely walking and biking. And, that could mean, using more of the right of way, getting closer to people's homes and having an effect on, what their street and their neighborhood feels and looks like. And I think it's important to have those conversations. And, I don't think that as a city, if we would just go in and put in some of these projects without talking to people, then the next project is going to be more difficult, right? And so we have, these projects that we've started that work on, and now there are a lot more projects that we have on our list in our TSP to get us to those goals. But they're more challenging ones, right? They're not just putting paint, and changing the striping. They're real infrastructure changes that affect what a street looks and feels like. And some of those do require more conversations, but I think others will be able to do with less conversation as we move forward. Like someone asked about High Street and, and what we have beyond High Street. And I think that, we have 13th Avenue Protected Bikeway, we have the East Amazon Protected Bikeway. People know them now and see what they are and have, opinions about them and are experiencing them. And so now when we go to do another one, and we're, making plans now for High Street. And so as we look to what the next ones are, having those on the ground will allow us to have the conversations much easier and I think quicker than we were having them before, because people understand them more, right? And so, the way that I think about this is we made a lot of those changes in the 70s. We're making some of those changes now, and what is the next big thing, right? Like, how do we get to that point where there isn't this dichotomy of, people driving and people biking, that everyone sort of sees like, oh, even when we put in this bike infrastructure, there's still plenty of space for people to drive who want or need to drive. What can we do to make, that non-low hanging fruit, that's difficult, but how do we make it less difficult, right? Like, what are those things that we can do that are going to be challenging, but aren't necessarily, feeling impossible to get done? So, I think one of the things that I just wanted to touch on, because we were running shorter on time, just so much good information. I'm going to get to some of the questions, but we've seen other cities, abroad, in Oregon, in the United States, doing some really innovative things. We have a lot in our plans that I think are going to really change what our city looks like and how people feel with, and their ability to walk, bike, and take transit. What are you most excited about, either that we're doing that we've seen from other cities, or that other cities are doing that you think we could be doing more of or better with? And I'll just open it up to let you all figure out who wants to go.
I won't highlight one specific project or place. I agree. I think there's some terrific action both locally and some of the plans are really inspiring and taking best practice from all across the country. But I think what I'm also excited to see, and I think other cities have deployed very effectively, and Shane, you mentioned this already, is pilots, right? And so just being able to test things and say, Shane, you made the point that even if you bring the data and you tell people, well, it worked here, even if it's a street that was literally identical, people say, well, it won't work in Eugene, right? And so being able to say, okay, well, it's going to be for a year or 6 months or whatever it might be. It's not permanent. Let's see how it goes. We're going to collect data. And just the fact that it's a pilot often means that you'll have less opposition if it's not immediately a permanent thing. See how it goes. And other cities have deployed that and deployed pilot programs really, really successfully. So pilot programs, tactical urbanism, and using low cost interventions like paint, which, to Shane's point, the 13th Avenue Bikeway, for example, as a person who uses that every day, I really love the concrete barrier that separates me from traffic. But at the same time, some paint and bollards would have gone a long way as well. So as a lower cost intervention and maybe a test before installing the rest of it. So that's one thing I would love to see more of, as well as some more piloting and tactical urbanism to test things.
So I have a couple reference points that I like to use. The first is we just had one of our alumni come and talk with some current students recently, and this alum just got hired by the city of Fort Collins to basically with a mandate to have Fort Collins, Colorado become the nation's first diamond level cycling city on the scale of the League of American Cyclists rate cities. So that's like Dutch level cycling. And she was hired explicitly with that as the mandate with city council support. So I think for a long time, our community has patted ourselves on the back of being pretty good for biking relative to other US cities, which is still true, but relative to what we can be, there's a lot to do. And so now I'm looking at like, great, well, Fort Collins, population 165,000 with a college, sound familiar, right? If that's their goal, maybe that's something we can do as well. And then the other sort of point of reference that I sometimes think about is I do go to Copenhagen, and I think of Copenhagen a lot, and I do think that there's a lot of comparisons we can make between Copenhagen and here, some that we can't. But there's large streets. It's a pretty big area, and it's been a 50-year process to make it so that half of all the trips are made by people on bike. But for their work trips, the typical, what's considered an acceptable and sort of normal work trip by bike is about 7 miles. And if you look at the Eugene Springfield metropolitan area with the University of Oregon right in the middle and make a line of 7 miles to the east, you're almost at the eastern edge of Springfield. And if you go 7 miles to the west, you're beyond the western edge of our urban growth boundary of our city limits. And so to think about what's actually possible as like normal, right? This is not like people in Copenhagen are like abnormal humans. They're just like normal people living their normal lives, and they're able to bike that way because the infrastructure makes it quick and easy. You don't have to pedal hard or anything like that. And so anyway, I look at that as a reference. So to be a really great biking city, those are some of the goals. And to get there, the answer is on every busy street, we need a protected bikeway, and we need a complete connected system of neighborhood greenways on our quieter streets. That's the end goal. So we know what to do. There's no lack of knowledge of how to do it. It's the money and it's the politics and it's the getting to the tipping point where it actually becomes a functional system for more people, to be able to see that creating a great biking city actually isn't taking away from anyone. It's actually adding a huge amount of benefit to everyone, including people who have to drive for their daily life. Actually, a great biking city makes it ironically easier for people who are car dependent to get around.
All right. Matt?
I'll just say I agree actually with both what Anne and Mark said. I think testing is a great way to get people past worst fears about what impacts may be from a system. It's not always simple to do trials, and I think part of that is where we land on our kind of risk tolerance. 13th Avenue, I think we decided we probably couldn't do that without having some signal improvements, and once you did that, that was the bulk of the project cost. Similarly with Willamette, we widened some lanes to be able to make it successful, because if it's not successful, if someone gets hurt, if it doesn't actually prove out the way you want it to, you're endangering the pilot being successful. So I just want to add that as some of those nuanced things we think about when we do think about pilots, but I really agree that that's a good way to do it. I'm excited to hear about Fort Collins. I hadn't heard that, Mark. I'd like us to dig in more and learn more about what they're doing, what their plans are there. I'm excited for us to get through the conversation that's restarting next week with our city council on moving ahead. So that's really thinking about corridor level change on, well, there's 5 streets under consideration, but most likely major corridor change on 3 that we're looking at, which would be River Road, Highway 99, and Coburg Road. Those are the type of system changes that I think when Mark says on busy streets, we need to think differently. that's that type of shift that we're talking about. Whether or not we've got all the infrastructure in those to meet that, I think that's part of the conversation. But it's a different way of thinking about some pretty major arterials and how they function for the city for everybody that uses them. And then I'll say also Franklin. I don't know how much folks on this have seen the Franklin designs. If we're able to get federal funding to do that project, it's going to completely change the way that corridor works, and in a way that will, I think, realize some of these same goals for having ample protected facilities for people biking, walking, and transit, and really rethinking an entire corridor in town.
Yeah, and I just, as you were mentioning that, I was bringing up Alan Pittman's comment about, that this, roundabout plan, which, I think we have yet to come to a final design. And so we don't know, but I think that's a good point of, redoing these major corridors is really going to have a huge impact, right? And if we redesign and rebuild these corridors in a way that you're making it safe and comfortable for people to walk and bike, that there is still movement of cars that's going to happen through there, and transit, and that you do have to create a facility. And it's just, how do you meet the goals that we have, and, have mobility for all, and prioritize active transportation as part of that, right? Like that's a great project to highlight the sort of the balance that will come of, prioritization that the city has to do. I think, it's an exciting project.
Yeah. Shane, can I comment real quickly on that point? So I will say, I do not agree that the roundabout designs are prioritizing cars. Roundabouts are really about safety and accessibility for all modes, and that the way that we're looking at designing those will be a little different probably than others that have been seen in the US. We're really trying to roundabout slow speeds on the entry, but we're really trying to define the pedestrian and bicycle space in a different way and think about it in more of some of the European models of roundabouts.
Right. And I think that's, as we think about these other communities and how they got to where they are, that looking at those designs is something that we're doing, right? Like that's a big part of it. All right. Well, we have a few more. We have a few more minutes left. I just want to highlight, I mentioned in the comment section that we had a lot of really great comments and questions. And so, I want to encourage, our panelists to hop on at some point in the next couple of days and read through the comments and questions, and maybe jot down some answers and continue the conversation on here, because this is a live stream that'll be up and people can watch. We've had, up to 30 people watching now, and people can watch later. So I appreciate all the comments so far, and want to give a couple minutes for each of you to kind of give a closing comment, and then I'm going to do a little giveaway trial here at the end. Oops. Why don't
okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Start. I guess my closing comment would be, we do have really great bike bones here. Like the upside is huge. So even though some of my comments felt maybe more passionately critical or impatient, I guess I'm impatient. But on the plus side, we have amazing bones here for really creating a world-class bike city. I would like us to be in the conversation with Fort Collins about getting up to that level. I would love to be able to have that type of self-reinforcing infrastructure, culture, elected leadership that's really pushing in those directions. So I think that we have a good start on bicycling 2.0, and let's just go quicker, go bigger, and do more. So let's hope that the funds from the feds come and that we're prepared as a city staff and city leadership to take full advantage of that.
Great. Anne, real quick, and then Matt.
I'd agree. Bigger, quicker, and that's a great goal in general. And I think Dan had a comment in the chat at one point, which I think I'll certainly take away from this, and I think all of us could think more about, which is what can we also as citizens of Eugene do to support staff and to also help push this vision, be it through elections of our local leaders, or be it through other forms of civic engagement. So I will certainly take that back with me today as well, and hopeful for a bike friendly future.
Great. And Matt, you get the last comment, and I'll.
Thanks, Shane. I just really want to say I appreciate the conversation with Mark and Ann. I think we're all passionate about this work, and it's okay to disagree and explore nuance and challenge each other. And so I appreciate being invited. And I would echo what Ann said. One of the ways that is really helpful when we're trying to implement projects is for folks to show up and express their support and what their vision and their values are around these changes in our system. So thank you.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you all. I feel like this was really a great conversation. And as I said, I want us to continue if we can hop on and answer some of those questions. Thanks so much to everyone who joined us today. Congratulations to Rob Zako. We'll be in touch to give you your grand prize from today's comment drawing. And Mark, Ann, and Matt, thanks for joining.
Thanks all.
Thanks for having us. Tons of fun. Good to see everyone.
Yeah. Good to see you. Take care.
Yeah.
All right. Our broadcast is off. I should have mentioned that we could have stayed on. Thanks again, you guys, for joining.
Yeah. Thanks for having.
No problem. Thanks, Shane.
And hopefully I wasn't offensive in any way, Matt. I'm trying to support you.
No, you weren't, Mark. Like I always enjoy talking with you about these things, and there's plenty more for us to learn, definitely. So I appreciate you kind of bringing in some of those perspectives. And I don't know, I'm not as in depth, I'm not as involved as I once was in some of my roles in the day-to-day work, and our team might be all over thinking about what Fort Collins and other cities are doing. I'm sure they probably are much more in the loop, but I think it's interesting to hear about what's happening across the country and how we're trying to adapt an auto-oriented